You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
A major change in a state's attitude towards an amendment started, as sometimes things do, not with a politician or court case, but with a group of students asking a simple question. It's 1989 at Hillside High School in Durham, North Carolina, and students are looking at the Constitution during the bicentennial and beginning to trace what had been added to it over time, not just what had been written in 1787. They found that the 13th Amendment had been ratified by North Carolina, as that amendment banning slavery should have been. But when they reached the 24th Amendment, the one that abolished the poll tax, they hit a gap. North Carolina, decades after the amendment had taken effect, had never formally ratified it. That discovery might have remained a classroom curiosity, but instead became a project in citizenship. The students learned what the poll tax had been, and they realized it wasn't just a tax, and it didn't just fund polls or elections or even government. It had another function. It was a deliberate barrier to voting, especially for African American citizens, and for that matter also for poor white citizens as well, as we're going to get into on this podcast. Many of them had never heard of it before. They were horrified by the realization that Americans once had to pay to vote. And they worked with local legislators to push a ratification bill into the North Carolina legislature. Now, this is 1989. The time for states to ratify was 1962, 1963, and the very tip of 1964. The amendment's already been added to the Constitution. But it was a kind of civics lesson playing out in real time. They tracked the bill, they wrote letters, and they watched as something symbolic, but long overdue, move through the process. Nothing would be changed by what North Carolina did, but it was symbolic. There's something else to say here. In particular, the 24th Amendment, which banned poll taxes, had not been ratified by a southern state except for Florida, where the senator from that state, Spencer Holland, an avid segregationist, we talked about this in a previous podcast. If you haven't listened to that one, go listen to the podcast on poll taxes in relation to Save America Act. Spencer Holland pushed that bill through nonetheless. Florida did not have a poll tax. And so they were kind of had a free hand to advocate for something that banned a practice that was only in other states at the time. So outside of Florida, no one had done it and no one had ratified it. And Georgia actually makes an attempt to do it. It doesn't get through their Senate. Virginia does not approve it until 1977, more than a decade after it had already become law. And North Carolina didn't have a great history with these things. The 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote, North Carolina ratifies it symbolically in 1971. That's 50 years after it passed. So here in 1989, because of a group of school students, they were able to get this done. There's another story, though, we didn't talk about in the passage of the 24th Amendment banning poll taxes. And I wish I would have, and I just didn't get the chance. And that's the bit of maneuvering to get it done. Because what happens, even though a senator who presumably is kind of buddy-buddy with the other segregationist Southern senators in the 1960s, I'd probably be seen at the Senate mess with them and voted with them on an awful lot of things. He doesn't get a special pass when he's trying to get through his poll tax bill. Another avid segregationist senator from Mississippi, James Eastland, blocks his bill in a committee. And it looks like it's going to end there. So even in 1962, we're still not going to ban poll taxes. You have to pay to vote. But Mike Mansfield, Senate leader, Democrat, takes over after Lyndon Johnson becomes vice president. He has his ways of working, and it involves, of all things, Alexander Hamilton's home. So there was a bill to approve Alexander Hamilton's getting his home turned into a national monument. Something a lot of people could get behind. I mean, maybe the Mississippi senator wasn't so happy that somebody from New York was getting something, but it's fine. He's not going to block it in his committee. So that bill got through. And so there was a process that existed then where Mike Mansfield could take a bill that was already moving, something with momentum and floor time, and offer a complete substitute amendment. That amendment would strike all existing text, all of it, and replace it entirely with the new language. So here, a bill that was to create a national memorial for Alexander Hamilton's home is replaced completely with the language of the 24th Amendment. If adopted, the bill stays the same, but the content and the law become something entirely different. It's a great way at that time to bypass bottlenecks, especially when a proposal is stalled in committee. This type of maneuver was not unusual in the Senate in the mid-20th century. It was useful for civil rights legislation, often faced committee chairs who would block things. By attaching a major proposal to a different moving bill, leadership could force the issue on the floor. Is this still allowed today, the way the 24th Amendment passed? Technically, yes, but practically it's much harder. The Senate still permits non-germane amendments. This would be considered, if you got a bill about Alexander Hamilton's home and you put in a poll tax ban, that's non-germane. That's not pertaining to the matter at hand. And you still are allowed to do it, but modern practice is tightened. It's the increased use of the cloture rule. So once a debate is limited, amendments generally have to be germane to the content you're discussing. Second, leaders now often fill the amendment tree. In other words, they block unrelated amendments altogether. And today's Senate is more tightly managed by party leadership. There's much less room for freewheeling substitutions, as there was in 1962. I don't know if it's clear if people are aware how much damage this poll tax did. And some of the things that people aren't aware of, perhaps, is that in some states it was cumulative, like in Virginia or Texas. If you hadn't paid in 1 year, you had to make it up the next year. Then in the third year, if you still hadn't paid for the past 2 years, you couldn't vote. You couldn't just pay that year's poll tax and vote. You had to pay your cumulative poll taxes. And in reading some accounts from the Federal Writers Project, these poll taxes were often, pretty high to where people really couldn't afford it, particularly people who were poorer. Not only that, many people paid the poll taxes because there was a timing trap built into the system. In some states, the tax had to be paid months before the election, not on election day. If you missed that window, even if you had money later and you wanted to show up to the polls, you couldn't do it. That adds another layer of blockage to people voting. In states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Virginia, this is what happens. And life can intervene in between paying the poll tax and voting. Illness, distance from polling places, intimidation, quite often, confusion about the process. The authorities in these states, if you're African American, say, or from a community that's just poor, that they don't want those votes, they're not going to help you find your polling place and like, governments do today. A person might scrape together the money after several years, only to face literacy tests, registration hurdles, or local pressure just not to vote. So I see in the account in the Federal Writers Project that people were paying these poll taxes and saying, well, I pay the poll taxes, but I never vote. So it just was a burden all around. Now, the most commonly thought of target group for poll taxes is African Americans, but in no state were they identified just by race alone. They were always universal. And the amount just spoke for itself. It's a heavy amount for some. It's a bearable amount for others. V.O.K. Jr., who analyzed this in the 1940s in Southern Politics and State and Nation, 1949, observed that the poll tax functioned less as a simple fee and more as a screen on political engagement. Many people who might technically qualify still didn't vote because the system required advanced planning, continued engagement, being aware of the process. It selected for a smaller, stable electorate that political machines liked. Poor whites in some of these states were not just collateral damage. They were part of the target. One of the things authorities and political machines feared is that poorer white communities and African Americans might get together at voting time. And indeed, you had the populist movements in the South. So Tom Watson is this Southern populist leader who's getting votes from poor white farmers, African American farmers as well. The irony, of course, is that he will get back into politics in the 1900s and come back as a white supremacist and forget his past. But part of the political force driving his own change, or why he couldn't win under the old system. Populists didn't do that well in southern states in the 1890s, the way their populist cousins in the West were winning their states. Wasn't happening in the South, partially because of these poll taxes. And it's not surprising that the same time you're getting a populist movement, late 1880s, 1890s, you're also seeing poll taxes. Mississippi Constitution enacted in 1890. One of the things we didn't get a chance to mention is that it's possible you didn't need a 24th Amendment at all. And that's because eventually there's a case in Virginia. In 1965, Annie Harper is a poor woman in Virginia, and she registers to vote, but she refuses to pay the state's $1.50 poll tax. Because of the 24th Amendment, she could vote in federal elections, but Virginia still required payment of poll tax for state elections. Harper challenges the rule, and her lawyers don't mention the 24th Amendment. They argued that the tax itself was unconstitutional because of the 14th Amendment. And that gets to a case, Harper versus Virginia Board of Elections, in the next year, 1966. And the court argues there had been so many previous court cases that keep saying that voting is not a privilege. Voting is a right. Undoubtedly, the court says the right of suffrage is a fundamental matter in a free and democratic society. The right to exercise the franchise in a free and unimpaired manner is preservative of other basic civil and political rights. Any alleged infringement of the right of citizens to vote must be carefully and meticulously scrutinized. And here's a key note from the Harper decision. It's argued that a state may exact fees from citizens for many kinds of licenses, that if it can demand from all an equal fee for a driver's license, it can demand from all an equal poll tax for voting. But we must remember that the interest of the state when it comes to voting is limited to the power to fix qualifications. Wealth, like race, creed, or color, is not germane to one's ability to participate intelligently in the electoral process. Lines drawn on the basis of wealth or property, like those of race, are traditionally disfavored. To introduce wealth or payment of a fee as a measure of one's voter qualifications is to introduce a capricious or irrelevant factor. In no part of this decision so far they mentioning the 24th Amendment. The dissent does a couple of times, but in the decision, they don't, meaning that, in other words, the dissent saying you already have the 24th. We don't need this. This court in 66 makes a decision outside of the 24th Amendment. In a recent searching re-examination of the Equal Protection Clause, we held, as already noted, that the opportunity for equal participation by all voters in election of state legislators is required. That's Reynolds v. Sims. That's the one that says one person, one vote. But in Harper, they continue, we decline to qualify that principle by sustaining this poll tax. Our conclusion, like that in Reynolds v. Sims, is founded not on what we think government policy should be, but what on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment requires. We have long been mindful, where fundamental rights and liberties are asserted under the Equal Protection Clause, classifications which might invade or restrain them must be closely scrutinized and carefully confined. Those principles apply here. For to repeat, wealth or fee paying has, in our view, no relation to voting qualifications. The right to vote is too precious, too fundamental, to be so burdened or conditioned. Reversed. Now, so, again, in this case, no mention that means it is possible, probable even, that by 1966, the court may have simply got rid of the poll tax without the need for an amendment. But we don't know. One of the reasons that Harper sues is because she's aware that she doesn't have to pay a poll tax in federal elections. Why does she have to do it for state elections? So maybe the lawsuit never comes. Maybe it's in the judges' minds, but it's not in their decision. So again, you have this, after the decision, you have this idea that possibly didn't even need it. Now, I will say, at the time of the 24th Amendment's activism for it and construction of it, some folks, like members of the NAACP and such, were not sure about this effort towards this amendment, that an amendment was the right way to go. Why not just go to court and seek this through constitutional means? But as it turned out, the amendment was successful. Thurgood Marshall, in particular, were skeptical of the 24th Amendment precisely because it was partial and that it only applied to those federal elections. Before Harper versus the Virginia Board of Elections, Marshall and NAACP lawyers were already attacking the machinery around poll taxes. There's a case called Butler versus Thompson where the NAACP challenged Virginia's poll tax directly, arguing that it simply violated the Constitution. Now, the Supreme Court declined to take up the case at that time, but it was the 1950s. In Smith versus Allwright, Marshall helped dismantle a system of a primary that only white voters could participate in, so that white voters could decide who all the general voters get to vote for in the November election. That was thrown out. It's not about poll taxes, though. But Thurgood Marshall and other lawyers were looking to knock out each piece of the restrictive system that had been placed upon them one by one. So maybe that groundwork was needed for the Harper case to happen. Now, this podcast and our previous podcast on poll taxes has mostly been poll taxes bad. And I think they're bad. So I'm not going to, argue too much against myself there. But I do want to bring up at least what the other side was, what people were saying. This is from a 1939 article in the San Angelo, Texas Standard Times. And it captures a moment when the poll tax was not only accepted, but actively advocated for in the pages of at least this newspaper in a majority white area of Texas. The headline is, West Texans strongly favor poll tax. and the paper reports that a small minority would open the polls to all without taxes, making clear that most respondents to their unofficial survey in this newspaper, kind of man-on-the-street interviews, would support this $1.75 requirement. Why would people argue for a poll tax? Some of them are outright, this is 1939, and they're just outright racist reasons. They're actually telling the newspaper that this will help to keep our elections with white voters only. Others being slightly less or more disguised, let's say, will say something like, this will make sure good people are voting, members of the community are voting, people invested in the community are voting, property owners are voting. But it's also that the poll tax was also tied to education. And so many interviewed in the San Angelo Times in 1939 tied the poll tax directly to education funding. So it's like, you cut this out and we can't support schools. I would retain the poll tax because it helps the schools and in Texas makes politics cleaner. The poll tax is a direct tax in support of schools. It's socially useful. Here's J.M. Hale, a housewife from Menard, Texas. I am in favor of retaining the poll tax because paying for it makes for more interested and intelligent voters. And if that is the only tax one pays, it makes him a more loyal citizen because he pays the school tax directly. A grocery clerk in Rochelle, Texas says, I would retain the poll tax because it helps the schools, and in Texas it makes politics cleaner and more in the white man's hand. Yes, he says this. The amount is so small for the privilege of voting that I think citizens ought to be glad to pay the tax. Again, from a woman from Rochelle, Texas, I would retain the tax for the revenue it gives to schools and because it gives each payer a more loyal feeling towards his government. Another comment claims that repealing would result in limiting the amount of intelligent voters. Literally people are saying in the pages of this newspaper, like, if you don't have this poll tax, anyone could show up and vote. Some mechanism must exist to limit participation. This is just the preferred tool. Because while you're using this tool, it funds the school as well. There is a minority view with a few quotes in this newspaper, not many, and one respondent states flatly that a poll tax is not just a mean of raising revenue. If school funds are needed, then raise a school fund, or take it from general taxation. But, these kind of viewpoints would keep the poll taxes at least in a half dozen states until 1964. So again, what's the relevance of discussing the poll tax? States aren't instituting literal poll taxes in 2026. That's not happening. The only relevance it has is voter ID laws. Do they apply? Because they require someone to pay a fee. And Kat has strong opinions on this. Don't you, Sheena? In any case, so you have two items that I bring for your perusal. 2005 case, a federal district court ruled that Georgia could not charge $20, that was too much of a burden and considered a poll tax. They had to go with a free ID system. However, this is a different Supreme Court from 2005, and the Supreme Court doesn't even listen necessarily right now to federal district courts, in 2026, and it never has to. It's the Supreme Court. So that decision only has a minor influence here. If you look at something that might be more influential in conservative circles, and we currently have a conservative Supreme Court, the Heritage Foundation, their main argument about the use of the 24th with voter ID laws is this. The 24th eliminates banning voting if it's by reason of a poll tax, not paying a poll tax. So And, I look at these things like you got to write a law some way, and over-focusing on each word isn't giving you what the people who made that amendment were trying to get at. But, okay, if you do look at the words, that creates what's called a but-for reasoning is it. So, in other words, if you can vote but for paying this poll tax, the argument that the Heritage Association has, which is going to give you a pretty good inkling of what conservative lawyers in the Supreme Court are going to be arguing, that means it has to be the reason the state is enforcing it. Ergo, if a state has a reason that is like, I just want to prevent voting fraud, they should be able to argue it doesn't meet the criteria of the 24th Amendment in a textual analysis. We'll see where all of this goes if it gets there. And I want to close with one thing. A Richmond Times Dispatch article got my attention. It's from 1970. This is 6 years after the 24th Amendment is passed. This is 4 years after the Supreme Court decision in Harper means you can't even tell people they can't vote in state elections if they didn't pay a poll tax. And the article is titled, Repeal of Antiquated Poll Likely. And it captures a strange thing about the poll tax, that even after it had been killed off in practice by the amendment to the Constitution, with 3/4 of the states ratifying it, and even after the Supreme Court said you can't, ban people from voting, people are still paying the tax. Virginia still technically had the tax in its Constitution, and local officials were still collecting this $1.50 levy. They were still sending out tax bill notices. And people, being loyal citizens, some of them not agreeing with that Supreme Court decision out of maybe a sense of loyalty in some local areas of the state of Virginia, and we have this in Mississippi as well, people are still paying that poll tax. Here's what the article says. Severed from any connection with voting, the poll tax nevertheless remained in effect, though it was virtually unenforceable and not worth the cost of going after delinquent poll tax payments. This article gets whimsical about the heyday of the poll tax and how it provided $1 million or more for state school funds. But with the justification of using it for voting, still for most people, even in Virginia at the time, whatever their feelings about the Supreme Court, most weren't paying the tax, and there was no incentive to pay it, and receipts had declined steadily. The Virginia Code Commission recommend repeal at this time, not primarily on moral or constitutional grounds, but because of its low or non-existent net yield. Because of its low or non-existent net yield. That's it. A little bit more that we didn't get to in that episode. Hope you find it interesting. I did. Thanks for listening.